The drum started before dawn. Soren felt it first in his back teeth, a pressure below the range of hearing, slow and rhythmic, like something enormous exhaling into the rock. He sat up in his bunk at Drev Station and held very still and listened to it with his whole body, the way his uncle had taught him to listen, not for what the sound was, but for what had gone quiet around it. The Plateau animals had gone quiet. The wind, which never stopped on Caliph Plateau, had dropped to nothing. Even the relay towers at the station's western perimeter had stopped their usual low cycling hum. He was 14 years old and alone at the station. His uncle had taken the land crawler to the lower ridge 3 days ago to service the seismic monitoring arrays, and he was not due back until tomorrow. Soren had run the station alone before. He had done it 4 times in 2 summers, long enough to know the difference between a system fault and a weather anomaly and a third category his uncle had never formally named but always described the same way, something that is not the station. He knew its systems, its rhythms, its sounds. This was not one of them. He got dressed and went to the observation deck. The sky was wrong. It was still an hour before sunrise, and the plateau spread away from the station in every direction: gray rock, sparse thorngrass, the distant rise of the Caliph Fault escarpment against the stars. Soren had looked at this sky every night of his 2 summers on the plateau, and he knew every satellite track, every relay blink, every orbital transit line. What was moving overhead now did not match any of them. It was not moving on a clean arc. It drifted, corrected, drifted again, a constellation of pale smears, greenish-white, spread across 4 degrees of sky, moving slowly southward on a path that was bringing it directly over the plateau. He went inside and pulled up the station's canopy watch terminal. The terminal was a hard link relay, no signal out unless he physically opened the transmitter cover and punched an active query. His uncle had taught him about that too. Drev Station sat inside a passive monitoring zone, which meant it received canopy watch feeds continuously, but did not broadcast unless queried. The reason, his uncle had explained, was that some things followed broadcast signatures. You kept your output dark unless you had something specific to say, and you said it fast. Soren read the canopy watch feed on the screen for a long time. The contact was already annotated. The canopy watch algorithms had tagged it before he had even sat down, running their pattern matching against the full archive and returning a match in under a second. The contact had a designation, Harrow class. The feed had automatic annotations. The canopy watch's algorithms ran pattern matching on everything that entered atmosphere, and what was over Caliph Plateau right now had triggered a match on a contact type logged in the archive for nearly 3,000 years. The annotation was terse, Harrow class. First confirmed RE entry since year 12,441, recovered calendar. Passive observation protocol active. Do not initiate broadcast. Below that in the station reference database, Soren found the full catalog entry. The Harrow was not a ship. It had no hull, no propulsion system that Earth's physicists had ever been able to classify in conventional terms. It was a collective organism, thousands of individual elements moving in coordinated resonance, maintaining a gravitationally coherent mass by a mechanism that the archive described, with characteristic scientific understatement, as not yet fully modeled. It operated by descent. It moved slowly through an atmosphere until it located an unshielded electromagnetic signature, descended over it and collected it. Collected was the archive's word. The entry did not elaborate on what collected meant in practice, but there were records from the period before Earth's infrastructure had been hardened, before the canopy watch, before the passive zone protocols, before the signature masking that now blanketed every inhabited zone on the planet. In those records, the locations the Harrow had descended over were afterward reported as silent. No one who had been present had remained to file a report. The archive noted the mechanism coolly. The Harrow tracks unshielded electromagnetic output. It descends when it locates a source. Masking protocol renders a site invisible to the targeting function. All inhabited infrastructure on Earth has been masked since year 3200 recovered calendar. All inhabited infrastructure. Soren sat with that for a moment. Then he pulled up the station's active systems log. The seismic monitoring array in the lower ridge, the one his uncle had gone to service, was running on a backup power cell that his uncle had replaced yesterday. The backup cell was a legacy unit, pre-standard, unshielded. His uncle had logged the replacement and flagged it for swap out on the next resupply run, 3 weeks out. It was broadcasting a raw, unmasked power signature at 4.7 milliwatts into open air. 4.7 milliwatts. It was almost nothing, less than the light from a single emergency strip, but the archive entry was precise. The Harrow's detection threshold was rated at 2 milliwatts minimum at surface range, under standard atmospheric conditions. The drum was louder now. Soren could feel it in his sternum. He looked at the canopy watch feed. The contact was moving steadily toward a point above the lower ridge, toward the seismic array, toward his uncle's crawler, which was parked 50 meters from the array, drawing from the same unshielded cell. He had two options. He could open the transmitter and broadcast a query, which would add Drev Station's signature to what was already in the air and pull the Harrow's attention to a second source. Or he could fix the problem directly. The lower ridge was 11 kilometers by land crawler. He did not have the crawler. He had, however, a full rack of standard-issue replacement power cells in the station's equipment bay, all of them shielded, post-standard, rated for masking compliance. The problem was getting them to the array. He checked the equipment bay's inventory. There was a single-unit relay drone, rated for 12 kilometers, with a tool mount rated for light payload. The station used it for minor equipment drops to the ridgeline sensor posts. It could carry one power cell. One was all he needed. He had the drone prepped and loaded in 14 minutes. His hands were steady. He noticed that about himself and filed it somewhere. The drum was in the walls by then. The station's exterior lights, all of them passive, all of them masked and compliant, were catching something in the air above the plateau. A faint greenish luminescence, diffuse and scattered like light through very deep water. It moved when the wind didn't. It pulsed in a slow rhythm that matched the drum's cadence exactly. Soren stood in the equipment bay doorway and looked up at it for 3 full seconds. It was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. It was also, the archive had made clear, something that located its targets partly by the electromagnetic signature of their nervous systems when they stood still in open air. He went back inside and launched the drone from the interior bay port. He watched its telemetry on the terminal screen, 11 kilometers to the ridge array. The drone's motor signature was masked, standard equipment. It moved at 62 kilometers per hour across the plateau floor, below the ridge line, using the terrain for cover the way the canopy watch protocols recommended. On the canopy watch feed, the Harrow contact was still tracking southward, still moving toward the ridge. The drone had 9 minutes of flight time remaining. 7 minutes in, the Harrow contact decelerated. It did not stop. It shifted its heading slightly, not toward the ridge, but toward the plateau center, toward Drev Station. Soren sat still in his chair and looked at the feed and ran the math. The station was masked. Every output it generated was within specification. He had not opened the transmitter. The drone was masked. The power cells in the bay were masked. There was nothing at Drev Station that should be visible to the Harrow. He looked at the equipment bay door. He had opened it manually, using the mechanical override, because the standard door motor was in maintenance mode. The mechanical override did not have a shielded actuator. It ran on an unshielded backup circuit rated at, he pulled up the bay specs on a secondary screen, 1.8 milliwatts. Below the Harrow's 2 milliwatt threshold, just below. The Harrow held its new heading for 40 seconds. Then it shifted back toward the ridge. Soren discovered that he had been holding his breath. He let it out slowly, deliberately, the way his uncle had taught him to exhale when a situation was still live. Don't rush it, don't make noise, just let the air go and keep your eyes on the screen. The drone reached the ridge array at minute 9. Soren switched to the camera feed. The array sat exactly where the station map showed it, a cluster of gray sensor housings bolted to a basalt shelf, the backup cell's indicator lights still burning unmasked in the pre-dawn dark, a pinpoint of amber that had no business being visible to anything in orbit. The tool mount's manipulator arm was a basic unit. It could unplug a standard connector and plug in a replacement, and nothing more. The archive entry had been right. The mechanism was simple. The unshielded backup cell had a standard connector. He guided the manipulator through the replacement sequence from the terminal screen, watching the drone's camera feed on a split display, while the canopy watch feed scrolled on the other half. The moment the old cell disconnected, the Harrow's tracking behavior changed. It decelerated sharply. The slow southward drift stopped. The contact hung motionless in the air above the ridge for a long time, long enough that Soren began to count seconds, and then lost track somewhere past 200. Then the Harrow moved again, not toward the ridge, not toward the plateau center. It drifted east slowly, the way a search pattern looked when it had exhausted its targets, methodical, wide, unhurried. Soren watched it trace 2 long circuits above the escarpment and felt the slow unwinding of something that had been coiled very tight. The new cell connected. The array's power signature dropped to 0.3 milliwatts, masked and compliant. There was nothing on the ridge now that the Harrow's targeting function could find. The array was invisible. The crawler was invisible. His uncle, if he was asleep in the crawler's cab, was invisible. On the canopy watch feed, a new annotation appeared below the contact status. Harrow-class contact holding at altitude 4,200 meters. Canopy watch active response units AT standby perimeter. No engagement ordered. Passive protocol maintained. He had not known the response units were there. He had assumed the canopy watch was watching. It always was, but the idea that there were active units already at a standby perimeter, holding position and waiting while he worked, settled into him slowly. They had been watching the whole time. They had seen the contact the moment it entered atmosphere. They had noted the unshielded signature at the ridge and assessed it and calculated the risk and decided. The station has the tools, the station has the protocols, let the station fix it. Trust the training. The Harrow drifted for another 20 minutes above the plateau. It made 3 slow circuits, each one slightly higher than the last, each one tracking nothing because there was nothing to track. Then it began to ascend. It took almost an hour to leave the upper atmosphere. The drum faded gradually from the sternum to the back teeth to nothing. The greenish luminescence thinned and dispersed and was gone. The wind came back. The thorn grass whispered against the station's walls. Somewhere out on the plateau, an animal called once in the darkness and was answered. Soren filed a maintenance completion report through the standard relay, the drone's power cell replacement, the spec notes on the legacy backup unit, the flag for expedited resupply. He did not file anything unusual. The canopy watch had the full contact record. They did not need him to tell them what had been overhead. The terminal's canopy watch feed updated one final time before he closed it. Harrow-class contact departed atmosphere. Passive protocol lifted. Archive updated. Confirmed return after 2,961 years. No engagement required. He sat with that for a while. No engagement required. Not because the Harrow was harmless. The archive's records from 3,000 years ago made that clear. Not because Earth had been lucky. Because for 3,000 years, every inhabited zone on the planet had been quietly, methodically shielded against exactly this kind of targeting function. Because the Canopy Watch had been watching the outer system for exactly this kind of re-entry signature. Because every backup power cell in every outpost equipment bay on the planet had been manufactured to masking standard, and the one that hadn't, the legacy unit in the lower ridge array, had been flagged and noted and was going to be replaced in 3 weeks. And in the meantime, there had been a drone and a boy on the plateau who knew the protocols. Not luck, not a miracle, not a genius. Just the long, patient work of people who had encountered the Harrow 3,000 years ago, survived it, studied it, and spent the intervening centuries making sure the encounter would go differently if it happened again. Dawn was beginning on the eastern escarpment when his uncle's voice came through on the hard link relay. "Station, this is Uncle Pren. I'm seeing some Canopy Watch chatter on the ridge terminal. Everything all right up there?" Soren looked at the empty sky. The first light was touching the Caliph fault line, turning the gray rock the color of old copper. The luminescence was gone. The drum was gone. The plateau looked exactly as it always did at dawn, still, vast, and indifferent to the things that had passed over it in the night. "Power cell replacement in the lower array," he said. "Legacy unit was out of spec. I used the drone. The station's clean." A pause longer than he expected. "Good work. I'll be back by noon." "Copy that." He closed the link and sat in the observation deck as the light spread across the plateau, and thought about the fact that somewhere above the outer atmosphere, the Harrow was moving on. It had come back after 3,000 years and found nothing. Not a dead world, not a weak one, just a world that had learned and remembered, and made itself invisible to exactly the things that would have taken it apart. He thought about all the people who had never met him and never would, the engineers who had standardized the masking spec, the archivists who had cross-referenced the contact logs, the planners who had flagged legacy equipment across 4 continents, and understood that he had not saved his uncle tonight. They had. He had just been the last link in a long chain, and he had held. He thought it might come back again, in another 3,000 years or 10,000. He thought it would find the same thing. He went and made breakfast and waited for his uncle to come home.